It's always interesting to do something like listen to a song and listen to how the different ones of us react to it, the message in it. It's, as human beings, we're completely captured by our origin, where we come from. And it's, I hadn't thought about that song for a long time, but when I hear those words, I hear Sammy Davis Jr.'s voice. It's just amazing. And have you ever thought, what in the world, if you've ever looked at a brain, it's kind of a lump of fat. And to think what's in the brain. That song was 51 years ago, and the minute he mentioned it, I could hear Sammy Davis Jr. singing it. I could watch him sing it. Where is that? And you look at the brain, it's just a hunk of fat. And you wonder, what an amazing creation that we are. It's very significant to me, and how we see God. And one of the things, we're going to be looking at Deuteronomy 22. The Torah portion today is Deuteronomy 21 from verse 10 through 22:12. And we're just going to look at 22. There's some things in here that really struck me as I look at this, what's going on in the world, and realize I'm going to talk about some things that are going to be just as unique as that song Greg brought up. Everyone's going to have a different reaction to it. I have quite a different reaction to it than Greg does. Because, and yet I totally get the side, there is something about human nature that says feed my appetites. But there's also a side, how many of you associate dessert with good things? To be honest with you, I am a very food-associated person, and dessert is what's good. You eat that other stuff because your body has to run. But if you're going to enjoy food, it's dessert. And I know it's inherited. It's not my fault. Ho-ho. I remember going to a Condi reunion, and there were 3 tables of desserts and 1 table of main dishes. And I said, this is my family. And yet, there is a thing in us that we live to feed our appetites, what Paul calls their God is their stomach, which, as Greg pointed out, it's always at war with the Lord. As we look at Deuteronomy 22, the Torah, there are a lot of ways to summarize the Torah, but more and more I can see why Yeshua and even some of the sages would say the whole Torah is do unto others what you do unto you. Seeing other people as in the image of God. And Deuteronomy 22 starts off with, you shall not see your brother's ox or his sheep going astray, and ignore them. You shall take them back to your brother. And if he does not live near you, and you do not know who he is, you shall bring it home to your house. And it shall stay with you until your brother seeks it. Then you shall restore it to him. And you shall do the same with his donkey, or with his garment, or with any lost thing of your brother's, which he loses and you find. You may not ignore it. You shall not see your brother's donkey or his ox fallen down by the way and ignore them. You shall help him to lift them up again. Do you notice how all this is in the imperative? If you studied English, you know what the imperative is, right? It doesn't say this would be a good idea, you might. It says do this. And the subject is implied. It's you do this. But in any language, there's some way of saying, this isn't optional. And so this starts off with, if you see something that belongs to your neighbor, you are under obligation to take care of it. Have you noticed that there's a strong segment of humanity that functions that way? Then there's another section that says, it's not my issue, I'm not going to worry about that. I find myself at times thinking, I don't want to get involved in that. Have you noticed that this is very strong? It says if you see something, it's your job to take care of it, and if you can't find the person it belongs to, you keep it until you can find who that person is.
It does say your brother, it doesn't say your enemy.
Well,
The enemy
Well, you know what's funny, though, is that in another place where this is talking, it says, even if it is your enemy. But,
in this day and age, it's not quite so simple.
well, it is interesting. It isn't as simple, but how many of you know that if you have to take the side of doing what God commands versus protecting your skin, what's the right decision? And it's not always easy. I'll be the first to admit that. The next one is kind of interesting. A woman shall not wear a man's garment, nor shall a man put on a woman's cloak, for whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God. Then, this is considered by the rabbis, at least a lot of them, to be the least command in the Torah, this next one. If you come across a bird's nest in any tree or on the ground, with young ones or eggs, and the mother sitting on the young or the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. In other words, if you're going to take the eggs, you may not take the mother. You shall let the mother go, but the young you may take for yourself, that it may go well with you, and that you may live long. When you build a house, you shall make a parapet on your roof, for your roof, that you may not bring the guilt of blood upon your house, if anyone should fall from it. And I think you all know that a lot of things happened on top of the house. The top of the house, especially then, the stone houses, most of them, and the top of the house was a place where people met. And it says you cannot build this without putting a fence around it, because someone might fall off. You shall not sow your vineyard with two kinds of seed, lest the whole field be forfeited, the crop that you have sown and the yield of the vineyard. You shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. You shall not wear cloth of wool and linen mixed together. You shall make for yourself tassels on the four corners of the garment with which you cover yourself. Just a group of commands that the Lord gives here. And I think, it's pretty plain on the tassels. If you go to Numbers 13, the tassels are commanded so that you will remember the word of the Lord. He said, you're to wear these forever with this blue center so that when you see that, you'll remember the law or the word of the Lord and you'll keep it. It's very much like my brother-in-law, Sam, and it worked for him, I guess, fairly well, but he would tie a string around his finger if he wanted to make sure he wasn't going to forget something. But I laughed and he'd look at it and he'd go, now why did I tie that on there? That's what I do. Greg, did you ever have that?
You read that part about having the barrier around the
Yeah, the parapet. Yeah.
parapet. And normally, what we would do is say, man, if you got so close to the edge you fell off, that's your problem. You deal with it. And rather than, well, I think I should build a parapet to keep everybody from getting over that edge. And that's not what we do. We just leave it up to the responsibility of the individual.
Yeah, it's interesting how the command to make the parapet, and of course the rabbis go off on this one. The rabbis say this is the justification for seatbelts, vaccines, all these things. Because this is the justification for seatbelts, vaccines, anything that society puts into effect to protect people. They say this is the justification, and I'm not going to go there right now. But it is significant what Greg just said. Our society struggles with the idea of freedom and responsibility. In fact, now we've all accepted it. I remember, I guess I'm pretty old, but I'm not that old. We never wore seatbelts. I drive down the road with the kids sitting on my lap. I can remember Janelle standing right on my lap while I'm driving and looking out at the road. And, you wouldn't do that now. Why? It's not safe. It's safe 90% of the time. It's the other 10% that's a drag. And that's how it is with, the parapet probably only saved, 0.1% of the people? But it says it's worth it. A lot of things going on in society today, it's hard to find that fine line between what's our responsibility and where do we give people freedom. And I think everyone knows if you give people freedom to do anything they want, society cannot endure. Because my freedom might hurt Greg. That's why we'll say, well, you're free, but you're not free to steal because you're damaging somebody. In any case, when you look at this passage, there's several things that come out to me in this. And I think everybody here, I mean, there are some Bible stories that are so much a part of our culture, I'm guessing everyone here can tell me. What did Cain say to God when God came to him and said, "Where's your brother Abel?" Everyone here knows it, don't you? You know. Why do you know that statement? You think about it. The greatest teaching in the Bible is almost always questions. Because what's the answer to, am I my brother's keeper? Yes, every time, all the time. It's not necessarily something we like. And yet, when you look at people, most of the time, it's kind of what Greg was talking about, this experience where you help somebody out. Most of the time, we're motivated to help people. In fact, we teach ourselves not to. Like Ron was saying, where it gets in our litigious society, we're so afraid to help. I mean, we know of people that have tried to help, it just turned into a mess. So I know I don't really like to stop when somebody's broken down by the side of the highway, but it's like between here and Delta, I will every time. Why do I do that? Because I have no idea when help is coming for that person. That's a long ways. Or I remember one time I was by myself and I'm driving west of Hinckley. You who live here, you know that west of Hinckley, there's not a lot of water. And there's a fellow out there. This is the middle of summer. It was in the high 90s. There's this fellow walking west. I stopped and I said, "Do you need something? Where are you going?" He said, "Well, I'm trying to hitchhike to go see my son in such and such a place." He said, "I'm so thirsty." He said, "Get in the truck." Maybe it's not safe, but the guy's going to die is what I thought. And all I had was a soda, and he wanted a drink of water. I didn't have any water anywhere. I dumped my pop out and let him have the ice in my cup. Then I took him to the border and fed him. And did I do this because I'm some great? No, it was just, the need was so great, anybody here would have done it. One time we were driving to council, Doug will remember, and some guy was out there, I think it was close to the severe dry lake bed. It was the middle of winter, it was snow and ice cold, and there was a fellow out there on the road. And he'd broken down, you remember? Yeah. He was so cold. It's kind of scary. And so it's very much part of who we are, but it's also important to remember it's a command. God says, do this. And it kind of like what Greg was alluding to, one of the reasons we learn the Word is because sometimes what I want to do is the opposite of what the Word says, and it's good to have that. To go, I really don't want to, but that's what I need to do in this situation. And one of the things that I've noticed, I mentioned that I see the golden rule as fulfilling the Torah. Treat others as you would be treated. But something else that seems close to this and related to it is the idea that people are made in God's image. That people have value. See, and something that Yeshua said in John 3 that everyone knows, he says, unless a man be born again, he cannot what? There's two things that are said there. He says unless he's born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom. But he says, unless you're born from above or born again, you cannot what? You can't see the kingdom. That's the word it uses. To perceive, to understand. There's something that happens in the supernatural experience of coming to the Lord that opens our eyes to see the kingdom. And if it doesn't, one of the things that I love what the evangelical movement has done to Christianity on this side, and I hate what it's done over here. And that what I hate is the formula thing. get you to say the sinner's prayer. I've never forgotten. Who was the fellow from Ely that was not quite right mentally that used to come over here? Jim? Jim Chachas. I mean, he was loony. But doesn't mean he was a bad person, but I've never forgotten. We were trying to help him. I was talking to him, and the Hutterites were here. And I forgot which one. He came up and said, "Are you saved?" And Jim looked at him like a deer in the headlights. What do you mean? And so we go through the sinner's prayer and all this right over there. And now, whoever it was, Paul says, he's going to heaven. I was thinking, we didn't help him at all. And I was just so turned off by it. But he meant well. And Jim was like, got to get through this so I can get away from these people. They're nuts, like me. But it's not a formula. When we know the Lord, our eyes are opened. And it's a process. But if I, quote, am born again and I don't see other humans as in the image of God, if I don't see other humans as worthy of love, priceless, then that spiritual experience is not complete. Dean.
Your experiences have a lot to do with how you react to somebody.
Oh, huge.
You talk about picking up a hitchhiker. I picked up a hitchhiker once, and I asked him the same question, "Where are you going?" He told me he was going to kill his sister's boyfriend who was beating her up.
I don't know what you do with that experience. Take him to jail?
I didn't know what to do. What did you do? I hauled him for a while. I had to turn, go somewhere else. I let him off. He said, "I don't kill you."
Well, Dean talks about picking up a hitchhiker that's going to kill who? His
Boyfriend.
his sister's boyfriend.
He's going to Las Vegas.
How come life is so much messier than just little...
Well, and you talk about Jim. You know, I took Jim from Estel to Delta because he had to leave. He had to take him in there. So I took him in there and dropped him off. He was back here before I got back. So I don't know how he had resources that I didn't have, and all I did was go fill up with fuel and then come back home. He was here when I got here.
It's a miracle.
So you talk about these things. I don't know if I picked up a hitchhiker.
Well, it's one of those things that it's like Doug was saying, when you find somebody that's in obvious dire straits, and what you have these conversations with the Lord when you're confronted with this kind of need, and you say, I realize that I'm called to be vulnerable. The gospel is not about being safe. Human nature is about being safe. It's a little bit what Greg was talking about with the song. There's something in us that wants to do the thing that we like, that makes us safe. It's not always necessarily opposed to what God's doing, but the ability to hear is really essential. And I think it's interesting to me in Matthew 25, excuse me, where Yeshua talks about judging the nations, and he divides them into the sheep and the goats. And you all remember, how did he distinguish the sheep from the goats? There's not one theological thing about this, is there? He says, you fed me when I was hungry. You clothed me when I was naked. You visited me when I was in prison. You took care of me when I was cold. And the sheep look at him and say, when did we do that? That's exactly, they say, the righteous will answer him, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? And when did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? They had no idea that what they were doing was ministering to the Lord. Why did they do it? And yet these are the sheep. And the goats had exactly the same question, except they say, when did we not do this? We weren't aware we didn't do this. And I would point out in this passage that it's risky to see other people as made in the image of God, because people made in the image of God did the Holocaust. I don't think sometimes we've looked and seen the full cost of freedom. When we're free to be good and we're free to be awful. And God rarely intervenes. He intervenes through people. That's how he does it. Anyway, yeah, go ahead, Robin.
What is the principle behind the commands in verses 9, 10, and 11? Not mixing things.
We're going to talk about that. Good question you asked it. I don't know. Actually, there are some things. How many of you were here when they planted cucumbers next to the cantaloupe? It was delicious, right? It didn't work. It didn't work. There are certain things you cannot mix. You have to keep them separate. Now, the Jewish rabbis, will tell you that the wool and linen thing, I'm just saying what they say, that Abel raised sheep. The wool represents Abel. Cain was a tiller of the earth. Linen comes from flax. Those are not to be mixed. You know what's significant about, not significant, but at least intriguing, is that part of the priest's clothing is wool and linen. But in terms of mixing, and I do want to take a little bit of time with this because there's a lot of confusion, and I'm not going to have to, I was going to read you a story. I don't think I've got time. But one of the things that we're facing right now in our culture is the inability, but it's also the decision to not distinguish. I think these commands, Robin, in my opinion, are about make sure you can discern the difference between this and that. How many of you would have ever dreamed that we would come to a place where we can't tell the difference between a boy and a girl? And what's more, if you make the distinction, you're a bigot. Lois was talking about going to the music educators meeting. It was a wonderful time. But you know what? They're having trouble describing young men who, as their voice changes, have all these problems with their vocal cords. They can't describe them as young men or boys, so what was it? Birth gender.
Your birth gender is boy. This is how you're going to develop.
So you can't call them a boy, but you can say there was a boy at birth gender. Now, if you ever, it could sound like it. I am not ripping into people that suffer from gender dysphoria. But it's interesting that our world has turned upside down because we can't tell the difference. Or we're not allowed to. And one of the things, and I realize this is for people who have faith in God, but Acts 17 says, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from any one of us. And then Paul quotes a Greek poet, in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are his offspring. And he goes on to just say, he's fixed the day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. I think it is so significant that Paul says God determined when you were born, the place you were born, the time you were born. There's not an accident about it. It gets back again to what Greg was talking about earlier. One of the challenges in life is embracing who God made you. Sometimes you have to be careful because there'll be the voices out there telling you you're not who God said you are. Those have to be rejected. But what I see happening to us today is we're telling people that they are their feelings, not the objective reality. And I think it's a dangerous place. Did you have that?
You know, when you're talking about God ordained, we've all had the dialogue once in a while. Sometimes I go, why do you find
Oh, boy.
So why did my mom do that? Why did you do that? Why did you make my life uncomfortable? And sometimes you have those dialogues. And then, worse than that, when I look at people born into destitute poverty or in a place where there's civil war or where children are trafficked, and I'm going, you said you could have that? It's really hard to sometimes understand.
Well, I think put might be the right word. God does determine where we're born, where we come from. One of the things that becomes very evident, and this is because as Christians we've lost our Jewish side. Sometimes we as Christians forget that God put us here to redeem these situations. It's our job. I can show you all through Scripture. And sometimes people say, oh, isn't that so sad? Well, no, it's not so sad. What are you doing about it? And, I think what you said, Lois, is very true. Many of us have said, why in the world was I born into this? Or, my parents did exactly what yours did. My mom went off. She joined the house of Aaron when Dad's like, what's happened to my wife? And I think coming to peace with who you are is very important because I'll share some things with you. Leah Thomas is a swimmer. She is born male, and she is transitioning to be a girl. As a male swimmer, she was ranked 462nd in the U.S. As a female swimmer, she's first. She's on the Penn State team, UPenn, not Penn State. Whew. That's like confusing the University of Utah and Utah State. No, I don't want to do that.
Don't do that.
I knew just exactly what you would say. But her teammates, and here again, how many of you ever thought it would be difficult to know what pronoun to use? Her, he, him, them, what? And I could be derisory. I don't mean to be. I'm just saying, why is no one backing up and saying, something's wrong? Because we can't say clearly what someone is. Anyway, her teammates had not spoken out. They seemed to be largely supportive, but then it started to come out that the teammates felt bullied by the university. They felt like third-class citizens. Many would cry after meets because they knew they were never going to beat him. What's more, even though she's transitioning to be a girl, she still likes girls. And they're in the dressing room with her. It's gross. And I'm not allowed to say that. What's interesting, she went to a meet where a girl who is transitioning to be a man has even had her breasts removed, beat her in a swim meet. And she's still allowed to compete as a woman because she has not taken any hormones yet. They're monitoring all this. And do you understand? I'm over here saying love, respect, compassion. These people are adults. There's a certain amount of freedom. But why is all of society being wagged by the tail? And no one's going to stand up and say it. So I'm saying it and saying, we need the grace of God to love people, but this is not a healthy situation. Ron. Well, I don't know. I have to be careful. It's going to be on Facebook right now. But and I'm just going to point something out. I was going to read to you The Emperor Who Had No Clothes because it is one of the greatest scriptural stories ever. I don't have time to read it. But you really don't. I didn't realize how much I didn't know. I mean, maybe you all know it. I didn't know it. I had forgotten in the story of The Emperor Had No Clothes that the swindlers who came in to make these clothes had said that only two groups of people would not be able to see these special, wonderful clothes. People who were not capable of doing their job or people who were morally deficient. So who is going to say they can't see the clothes? And you can't see the relationship to today? What I'm saying here would be construed as bigoted. But I'm just going to point something out. You're not allowed to do this in every case. How many of you know you're not allowed to say you're black if you're not? Rachel Dolezal made a career of being black. She grew up in a very conservative Christian home in Montana, did not like it. She curled her hair, she darkened her skin just a little, and she had a position in African Studies at Eastern Washington University. She was president of the NAACP in Spokane. Then somebody asked her, "Are you really African American?" And she stumbled, what do you mean? She's as white as the driven snow. Did we in society let her be what she felt like? This is what she said. "For me, how I feel is more powerful than how I was born." I really feel it hasn't affected it at all, because I wasn't identifying as black in order to make people happy or make people upset or whatever. I wasn't seeking fame. I was being me. That's not a biblical thing. I mean, I can be me all the time, but that's not necessarily what God wants. The thing I think is interesting is our society took every job, robbed her of everything. It destroyed her because she said, "I feel like a black." And I thought, am I living in this world where you can't feel like a black, but a boy can feel like a girl, and if I say anything, I'm a jerk and a bigot? You may not have noticed, but this is not scientific. It's not objective.
Well, science changed. Notice that?
Follow the science. Well, and then our senator from Massachusetts spent her whole life putting her ethnic identity as Native American. And finally, she sent in her DNA. And they wrote back and they said, "We're pretty sure that back 6 or 7 generations there may have been a Native American." And the Cherokee Nation said, "You've got to stop saying this." And she did. She backed up. In her 1986 registration card she filled out for the State Bar of Texas, she wrote that she was an American Indian. And here, I'm not picking on Liz Warren. She's nutty in my opinion, but she's pretty smart too. But I'm saying that we would not let her do that. We would not let her say that she was an American Indian even though she felt like it. And if people won't stand up and at least back and go, "What's happening?" We can't make a distinction. Like you were saying, Robin, why does God say men don't wear women's clothes and women don't wear man's clothes? I think he's saying, don't lose your sense of distinction. Don't lose the ability to say, that's a cantaloupe, that's a cucumber. They're wonderful. At least some of us like cucumbers. But they're awful together. Anybody remember those green? I love those green cantaloupe. They were horrible. You could look at it, take a bite, because it was neither fair nor foul. And I think there's a strong thing in Scripture about being able to make a distinction about what something is. And I don't have time to read the story. It's a wonderful story. It is just wonderful. The story of, I'm always amazed that as I get older, the fairy tales and the legends and the things I heard come back and I realize the wisdom of them. But in The Emperor Who Had No Clothes, because these swindlers had put it in the minds of all the people that only those, let me see if I can find what they said. And I had forgotten this part of it.
Well, I don't think every version has that part. But
Well, the version is Hans Christian Andersen. There's just one version, and we've summarized it. Let's see. Oh, I see. They had this wonderful cloth that became invisible to anyone who was unfit for their office or unusually stupid. it's perfect, right? Who's going to say anything? And the The emperor was a little nervous, so he sent an old minister the first time. He didn't want to go see the clothes, and his minister looked in there, and he couldn't see a thing. And he said, I know I'm not completely stupid, so I must not be fit for my office. I'm not the most beautiful cloth I've ever seen. And it's great how it snowballed until finally here's the emperor walking naked down the street because no one dares say he hasn't got anything on. Finally, a little boy, let's see what is it. But he hasn't got anything on, a little child said. Did you ever hear such innocent prattle, said its father. And one person whispered to another what the child had said. He hasn't anything on. A child says he hasn't anything on. But he hasn't got anything on, the whole town cried at last. And the emperor shivered, for he suspected they were right. But he thought, this procession has got to go on. So he walked more proudly than ever, as his nobleman held high the train that wasn't there at all. And if you haven't read this story, it's fantastic. The story of Hans Christian Andersen is fantastic, but he was kind of a messed up individual like all of us. But I would just say we need to be careful right now in society when we don't dare say the truth. We do not need to injure. In fact, it's another command, to speak the truth in love. We don't need to tear people up. There's a lot of... How many of you know that the Bible predicted that we would come into a time where identity was confused? That people wouldn't know who they were. Exactly, that's where we are. So people need to be loved. They need to be embraced and cultivated. But there's one more story I'll tell you. Greg, go ahead.
You say that, and it's true. You know, speak the truth in love. And love in this instant, if you speak the truth, is not this frilly, fluffy.
No, it can hurt sometimes.
It takes courage. It takes bravery to speak in that way, because more likely than not, whoever you're speaking to is going to be offended by you speaking the truth. And we do not like to have people offended at us, but that's what speaking the truth in love often entails. I know of instances in dealing with transgender where people have been convinced that it's the proper way to go, that they would destroy themselves, totally destroy themselves. How do you speak the truth in love to a person that is going to destroy themselves? It's not easy, and it takes, because if we were to speak words like that, we would have people not even speak with us ever again because of speaking the truth in love. And yet, how do you do it? I almost feel provoked to get to a place where we're willing to speak the truth in love. Because if we don't, people are going to die. And it's not a simple thing. It's very serious to a lot of people. It's not really. The truth is not really and fluffy. It's deadly. It's eternal. And it's something that I don't know how to come to grips with stuff like that any more than it. But the truth is that God is asking us to come to grips with stuff like this. And it's not easy.
And I agree. You know, Greg said sometimes speaking the truth in love is difficult. Here's one of the things I would point out, is that just speaking the truth isn't going to fix it. It's that you need to learn how to stand for the truth. And I'm going to give you another example that shows you that sometimes it's hard. For instance, if your friend, your husband, your wife, your child is dying with a drug addiction, you don't say, well, drug addiction is fine. But on the other hand, you do everything you can to save the person. It's not easy. And sometimes you'll love people and they'll die, right? You'll do everything you can and you'll lose them. But embracing a lie doesn't help. How many of you know the Carpenters? The Carpenters. You've got a ticket to ride? Monday, Close to You. Very famous group. And why am I bringing them up? Richard Carpenter was a gifted musician right out of it. He took piano and it got boring, and so he went off and did his own stuff. He's one of these people that could listen and play, and then he did go get classically trained. But he and Karen, she was a drummer originally, but they developed a very unique style. If you haven't listened to their music, it's really what we would probably call mellow pop. I love their music. I like it a lot. But the thing that's interesting about them is what was the end of their group? What caused the end? Karen died at 33. What did she die from? She actually died of a heart attack brought on by anorexia. And for years she fought that she had a problem. She did not believe she had a problem. And she finally could see that she had a terrible problem. And so she got treatment and felt like, and she maintained her weight after this treatment at about 108 pounds, which for her is still pretty thin. She's a tall girl. But the interesting thing I'm mentioning to you, have you ever talked to anorexic people? And there are people with anorexia that have something called body dysmorphic disorder. What do I mean? You look in the mirror and what do you see? You do not see truth. There are some of these people, it's mostly girls. There are men, but mostly girls. They'll look in the mirror, they're emaciated, 78 pounds and 5'6". And what do they see? A fat person. Why am I bringing this out? Because our brain isn't always a friend. I mean, how many of you know that the Bible says, and I'm not saying this about anorexics, but in 2 Corinthians it says that people will refuse to love the truth. And what will happen? God will send them a delusion. You can believe something so strongly that facts are irrelevant. In fact, if you want to look at anything, look at the society we're living in right now with all these feuds that we're having, and most of us are not affected by evidence on both sides. We've made up our minds, don't confuse me with facts. And I think there's a lot of stuff I think particularly in the sexual realm, we see some real odd things happening. But I was thinking about, it's almost exactly what Greg mentioned about you need to be able to tell the truth. You've got to learn how not to compromise the truth. And I do think there is one time when people don't know the truth that you agree with them. That's a person with dementia. I learned the hard way. If Dad was on the Great Walls of China, just go with him. Just go with him. Don't fix it. Don't correct it. Don't change the date. This is one time. That's fine. Most of the time, believing lies, like Greg says, will kill us. And how many of you know right now that our society believes that pornography is harmless? Can anyone find any evidence that it's harmless? Every sociological study you'll ever see, it causes all kinds of problems. It's horrible for marriages. Pornography is horrible for marriages because people start becoming objects. How can you meet my need or my lust? Or it's the Candyman thing again. And yet, that's the official thing right now. Pornography is harmless. The other thing is, recreational sex has no impact. Have sex with who you want, when, how, doesn't bother people. And you have this group of kids that's messing them up and they're falling apart. We can't talk about them because it really is fine. This thing of making reality what we want it to be is endemic in the culture right now. We're not interested in the truth if it goes against my opinion. And if you haven't noticed, right now, how I feel is running the world in some cases. I thought it was interesting, too, if people are telling me that before people getting married, a boy and a girl ought to live together for a while and figure each other out and see if this is really going to work. And of course, a study just came out this week. The most durable, successful marriages are girls and boys who got married and didn't live together first. Does that mean every one of these will work? No. I'm just saying, statistically, this is the group. This is the most stable. Are we going to hear a lot about that study? No, it doesn't fit what we believe, how I feel. And I think the danger with going where we feel is what Greg said. People are going to die. In Revelation 3, the seventh church of Laodicea, I know you all remember this, but I think it's significant that Yeshua comes to them and he says, "You say I'm rich, I have prospered, I need nothing," not realizing that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. I counsel you to buy from me gold refined by fire, so that you may be rich, and white garments so that you may clothe yourself, and the shame of your nakedness may not be seen, and salve to anoint your eyes so that you may see. What is Yeshua telling that church? He says, how you see yourself is not reality at all, but I'm saying, come to me. I've got what you need so that you will be rich, so that you will be clothed, and so that you can see. And I don't think we have any better prescription available to us today than this one. That people need the Lord. And sometimes the best way they get the Lord is in this sad, miserable fact of He's got to be seen in us. We don't always get it right. We don't always say it right. But Yeshua said in John 18 when he was discussing with Pilate, and Pilate was saying, they got to talking about what's truth. And Yeshua's made a statement that is a blessing to all of us and kind of convicts all of us. He says, everyone on the side of truth listens to me. I thought, Lord, am I on the side of truth? Do I want the truth more than I want anything else? And that becomes the very defining characteristic of the age we're in. See, a lot of people are worried about these are the last days. According to the Bible, we've been in the last days for 2,000 years. So yeah, they are. But we worry about who's going to do this and what's going to happen and who's the mark of the beast, who's the Antichrist and all that, when really the number one challenge for you and for me in this day is, what is the truth? Who is the truth? And how does that impact how I live? And that may sound simplistic, but it can be a challenge. I thank the Lord that He shows us His truth in so many ways. And I was thinking about this because I shared on Facebook the emperor who had no clothes. And the responses are so what I thought they would be. Everyone thinks the other people don't have clothes on. I just felt the Holy Spirit saying, John, this story is useless to you until you can see yourself in the story. That's where I can help you. Have you ever noticed how magnificent you feel when you look and see how the other benighted people can't see the truth? But you know what's going on. I think it's kind of funny. The emperor, well, I might be naked, but this is a procession and we've got to go on. I love that story. We're blessed. We're so blessed to have the truth, and the truth is a person. But I think it's just good as we close today. There's a lot of untruth that's going through our society. How do we stand for the truth, be loving, but not compromising? Because I think it's already plain. We're going down some paths. I honestly think, it's time to stop, but just a prediction, that this has gone so far in women's sports, we're about to see an eruption. They're done. They're not going to do it anymore. And they don't want to hate anybody, they don't want to hurt anybody, but there are women that spent their whole lives training and practicing to do some skill, some sport, and to know they can never win. You want to call something anger? And it's not been politically correct to say anything. Once you tear that scab off, it's here. And in a certain sense, God lets his people, he lets the kingdom be there to pick up the pieces. I like another thing that Paul says. We'll close with this, if I can actually close. Remember my dad saying, the plane's coming in for a landing, but it's got to make one more. Is there a Conrad back there? Now I forgot what I was going to say. Shame. No, I remember. Paul says we can do nothing against the truth. And I think that's the thing to remember. That Yeshua is the light, the way, the truth, and the life. We can't do anything against that. We can rebel, but in the end, that's what lasts. That's the foundation. Let's all stand. Chandra, would you say the prayer for us, please?